Welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, I'm talking with Tiffany Engen, who is a full time mom of two children and a survivor of multiple perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. She is a strong advocate for maternal mental health, a full spectrum doula, birth photographer, perinatal educator, and also perinatal mental health certified. Tiffany volunteers as a support coordinator and peer mentor with PSI. There are many things in her story that I feel like are really important for people to be aware of. One is when there are diagnoses in childhood, whether they're diagnosed correctly or misdiagnosed, um, those types of things can be a risk factor for perinatal mental health issues later on in life. She also talks about having a loss of a parent during her first pregnancy and the incredible stress and impact that that had on her experience of pregnancy and postpartum. And in her second pregnancy, the development of very intense, intrusive thoughts that were debilitating for her. And how she coped during a very, very intense period of time where she did not have support, did not have the support system she needed, didn't have a full community. Although there were one or two people that were lifelines, um, for her when somebody's going through something so intense and doesn't feel like they can talk about it. It is very important to have a support system in place and do as much preventative work ahead of time as possible. When you know you have risk factors, a lot of times people don't know that they have risk factors. And Tiffany's experience is multifaceted. There are a lot of things at play for her that have contributed to how and why she felt the way that she felt. So I'm grateful for her coming on, and let's talk with Tiffany. Welcome, Tiffany. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you're going to share your story. And I know a little bit from what you told me before we started that some of your story has a backdrop that starts in childhood. So, yeah, I'd love for you to start there and let us know about what happened for you.
My story is a bit multifaceted because I grew up in a world that is for neurotypical people, and I am neurodivergent. And so, as a small child, I was given medications very early on to try and treat some of my neurodivergence. And it didn't go that well. I had a lot of side effects. I had a lot of adverse reactions and things like that. So my mother discontinued that medication. But about a couple years, I want to say maybe 2 years after discontinuing that medication, I developed panic attacks
Mm.
pretty severely at age 12. So
Oh,
I was
that's
medicated
awful.
again.
Uh-huh.
They didn't really, I think back then in the 90s, there wasn't many solutions for children who were
Mm-hmm.
experiencing what I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was put on Paxil, which is a pretty intense medication for a young child. And I stayed on that probably until I was 18. I had always really wanted to get off that medication because I had such intense withdrawal sometimes if I missed a
Mm-hmm.
dose.
Oh.
And it just was really kind of not very effective either. I still had pretty severe panic attacks. And they had given me, additional medication that was like benzodiazepines, to try and manage those acute panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Those are
so
as
I think,
needed. You just were taking
yeah,
those as needed. Mm-hmm.
yeah, they were like, in the middle of a severe panic attack, take this
Mm-hmm.
Valium or this Ativan or whatever. Um, I think around 18, because I had gotten married and I knew that there was a potential for me to conceive, I decided to get off that medication and was put on Effexor, because they said at that point it was like the safer one if I were
Mm-hmm.
to conceive.
Mm-hmm.
So I was on Effexor for about 3 years, I think. Um, and at that point, I really just wanted to be free from prescription medications. I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to, just be in my body. So I had attempted to titrate off of meds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this was, during a divorce. I had recently been divorced and I was trying to get off medications also because I was concerned about being able to afford them and access them.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So that was a huge concern as well. So I decided to titrate off of medications, and I was pretty successful. I was just about on the lowest dose possible that I had ever been on in my entire life, when I conceived my son.
Mm-hmm.
So I got off everything once I found out I was pregnant, and I had a few weeks in there that I was really trying to do my best to just kind of cope with the experience. And
Mm-hmm.
it was really, really hard. I had no skills at that point in my life to manage all the symptoms that I was enduring. So my care providers put me on Zoloft. That was the one that they deemed, safe for pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And I remained on that medication, I think, until about 2.5 years postpartum,
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't want him to continue to breastfeed and receive that medication through me. I really wanted to get everything out of our systems. So I eventually fully liberated myself from that medication. Like I said, about 2.5 years postpartum.
Can I ask if during the time you were taking it, were your symptoms like better managed, or like did you feel okay?
I think I think it's a very complicated question because I
Mm-hmm.
had a lot of unacknowledged PTSD.
Oh, there you go.
So I think there was, at that point, things that I was just trying to shut out and
Mm-hmm.
shut down and
Mm-hmm.
quiet without
Mm-hmm.
really realizing that that was behind a lot of my panic attacks and a lot of my anxiety. And so the medications just sort of muted, I think, things, but they didn't fully eliminate any of what was going on. I still had a lot of triggers.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it is. I think it's a good point, or a good thing for people to hear too. That you're right. If there's still a lot of unhealed, unprocessed, especially with trauma, medication can help to a point.
Yeah.
And then I think, as you were saying before, and I don't know about this time in your life, but when you first were starting with, trying to get off medications, you didn't quite have the skill set or tools, or maybe, I
Hmm.
don't know, sometimes people don't even have a grasp yet on what all is impacting them. So
Yeah,
it's
I didn't have
hard to, uh huh,
an awareness of like
right,
what I was even really going and dealing with. I
right.
just, I kind of grew up with this fundamental belief that I was broken, that like
Oh,
just something was wrong with
that
me.
sucks.
It was really hard to grow
Yeah,
up with that,
yeah,
because one being, the neurodivergent kid in a family, there was a lot of, pointing the finger and like labeling me
right,
as difficult and bad and, dramatic and all of those negative associations, right?
right,
But there was
right.
no understanding that I was just different
Mm-hmm.
and I needed a different environment.
Right.
Um, and so that's why there was so much complex PTSD. There was so much complex childhood trauma. It was
Mm-hmm.
so much built up in my nervous system, in my body, that
Right.
I think, you know, maybe under different circumstances with different supports and stuff, I could have had that awareness sooner, and
Mm-hmm.
medications may have been more effective for me. But due to, the certain ingredients in my soup, it just wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for expanding on that. Okay. So you said 2.5 years postpartum. Um,
Yeah.
okay.
I breastfed my son for about 3.5 years. And
Mm-hmm.
so I really at that point was like, I don't want him getting this in my milk. I didn't realize at the time too that he was also neurodivergent. And so I thought maybe the medications were contributing to the things, his behaviors and the things that I was experiencing with him as a toddler. So I wanted to get that, out of the equation. Um, and also just finally, not have to be sort of ball and chained by this prescription that I had to always have at
Mm-hmm.
all times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I did wean myself off of that, and he did continue to breastfeed for about a year after, eliminating that medication. And then I kind of was on my own journey to discovering his neurodivergence, and then therefore acknowledging and realizing my own.
Oh, got it. Right.
Because I think for a long time I rejected it. I
Mm-hmm.
was like, I'm not, there's nothing wrong with me, this isn't true.
Mm.
So it took a
Like
really
the
long
stuff from
time.
childhood wasn't
Yeah,
true, or oh, got
yeah,
it.
yeah. Because it was just very painful. It was very painful for me. It felt very stigmatizing. And so
Sure.
I rejected a lot of it and didn't realize at that time the oh, I don't know the word that I'm looking for, but basically the freedom that comes with really finally fully embracing who I am and my
Yeah.
differences and
Yeah.
acknowledging and loving them instead
Yeah.
of, trying to bury them away.
Right. Right. That's
Yeah.
powerful. It is. Because otherwise you're just fighting with yourself the whole time, and that sucks. It's
Yeah. It
really
does.
it's really hard.
It's awful. And I think
Mm.
I've finally come to a place now in my mid 30s of just accepting that these are my differences and this
Right.
is how, like how I am, and there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a difference.
Right. Right. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. A lot of people are in that struggle, and um, more and more people that I'm talking to on the podcast as well are finding out about their neurodivergence after having kids, or similar to you, like seeing something in their children and learning that they also are dealing with something or had been dealing with something.
The main thing with my son also was I
Yeah.
had lost my father at six
Yeah.
months postpartum. And so I was
Mm.
dealing with a lot of grief and loss there.
That's rough.
Because a lot of my childhood trauma was related to being afraid of losing him.
Mm.
He was very sick from very early on in my life. When I was about 3 or 4, he almost died.
Wow.
And I carried that like traumatic fear of like, is he going to see me grow up? Is he going to be around? When
Right.
is he going to when is he going to die? And so for that to finally come to fruition at, such a vulnerable time for me,
Yeah.
was really intense to, change the whole entire family dynamic. He was no longer there.
Right.
Um, he was also the parent that I was most connected with in
Mm.
childhood versus my mother. There was a lot
Mm-hmm.
of mother wounding in
Mm.
my early years. And so it was hard to be a mom and not feel connected to my own mom and not have a parent to turn to for that guidance.
Yeah.
But it facilitated a lot of healing in that relationship with my mother that needed to happen,
Oh,
which was really difficult and painful and messy,
for sure.
but it it did initiate that process,
Yeah.
with him being gone.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, grief complicates everything, and especially when it's such a key person in your life. And I know for a lot of people, it's hard to differentiate and often not possible to
Mhm.
differentiate like grief from depression or anxiety. It's just all one big
It
pile
was one
of
big
like
mess.
terrible. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the grief process in and of its own is all quite messy. Meaning, feelings all the time, everywhere. You don't know
Hmm.
when, you don't know how intense it will be. And
Yeah,
that's
because I
also
remember,
hard when you're,
having that baby and like not wanting to feed myself, not
mm-hmm,
wanting to get up and shower,
yeah,
not wanting to like just wanting to cry all the time, but
right,
having to tend to my newborn
right,
because I was solo parenting at the time and I didn't have any help. And there was like no one there to pick
mm,
up when I couldn't fall apart completely.
right,
So I think that is really important to discuss for a lot of people, especially
yeah,
for parents who are losing their parent and becoming a parent themselves.
yeah,
You're not allotted the time to fully fall apart that you need in
mm-hmm,
order to move forward. So
right,
I've had to bit by bit, piece by piece, process that grief over the last 12 years,
mm,
um, in chunks. You know what I mean? Like I've never
yeah,
been able to fully get through it, but it's been a journey of
yeah.
processing that loss.
There's so much happening already during in your in yourself within yourself about your transition into being a parent on its own is a lot to process and try and figure out. Um, and then this added complexity of grief and figuring out things that, oh my gosh, it's an incredible amount of stress you had at that time. A lot of
Yeah,
it.
it was really hard, um, to just have to, feel so much pain
Mm-hmm.
while also trying to be present for this new life that I brought into the world
Right.
and figure out who I am as a mom and what does that mean and look like and how do I do this thing
Right.
and um but also having kind of lost a little bit of my will to live, because
Mm-hmm.
of losing my dad and just that was my first probably true significant loss in
Yeah.
life. I've
Yeah.
had so many things happen since then, and I've had such an intricate dance with grief and impermanence after that loss.
Mm.
Um, but that was such a catalyst of change for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite intense.
Yeah.
So after you coming off of the medications, how did you fare? What was that like for you?
Um, I had a lot of learning to do. I had a lot of, because when you kind of grow up for so many years having that tiny bottle of Ativan or Valium in your purse, and you know that that's the first thing you reach for when you're having an acute panic attack, and you're no longer doing that, like now you have to redirect to other coping strategies and
Right.
find like what else can help you
Mm-hmm.
in that moment. Um, and how to be with such intense feelings without trying to quiet them.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so it was a huge adjustment period, and I had a lot going on. Like I said, I was learning my son was neurodivergent, and he had lots of big feelings and lots of meltdowns and he was a very high needs child.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pouring so much into my son, and I was trying to navigate my relationship with his father at that point and
Mm.
trying to figure out how to, bring us back together and bring peace. And so there was a lot of moving parts,
So many.
and a lot of little, very little support, very little guidance in there. But, I think it was one of those things that was one day at a time, 1 minute
Right.
at a time,
Right.
just very small chunks of trying to cope.
So um, I mean, it sounds like that journey was you figuring it out without support means like not no therapy, no,
Hmm.
family giving you tips or tricks or supportive ones, anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I did have my brother. My brother
Okay.
was, he was very, he was always my person that I would call, like, in a crisis, panic attack or whatever, like,
Mm-hmm.
help me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he was doing his best to try to, guide me as much as he could with what he had at the time. Um, but, it did lead me to realize like I needed something more. I needed to find somebody just for me, um, that had a little bit of a removed perspective instead
Right.
of being so close in the family,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that was sort of like my first, I'm gonna need to find something else. I'm gonna need to find somebody. But it took me a long time to act on it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, there is so much concern and stigma with like, how is someone gonna interpret what I'm saying? Are
Mm-hmm.
they going to understand me? Are they going to take it the wrong way? Is
Right.
it going to escalate into something that I don't want to deal with? Or is this going to actually be helpful?
Right.
And I think that is probably the main concern for most people
Oh yeah.
experiencing perinatal mental health issues is they're terrified to say the wrong thing to the wrong person
Yeah.
and then, have things sort of snowball from there. But um yeah, I want to lead us into why I came on today because my experience with my son, while it was massive in its own right, um, I think due to the medications, it wasn't as traumatic for me as it was with my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
When I conceived my daughter a few years later, I had been completely opposed to, any medications, and I had been off them for a couple of years. And so while I was, well acquainted with my anxiety and depression at that point, and then finally coming into awareness about my complex childhood trauma,
Mm.
um, my nervous system just could not handle what was coming from that pregnancy. Like whatever she brought in with her into my body was so shocking. And it was like a light switch. Like it
Oh,
literally just happened. I can pinpoint where I was, the time of day.
oh,
Like it was like there was a before this and an after this.
oh gosh.
And
Okay.
it made no sense, like
This is during pregnancy.
yeah, during my
Around.
second trimester of
Okay.
being pregnant with her.
Okay.
Um, I was just taking my son to the park. We were out, trying to play at the park, and everything prior to that moment was normal, like I guess. But once something changed, I don't know what it was. It was like a light switch went off in my brain, and I had my first very disturbing, intrusive thought, and it scared
Mm-mm.
the shit out of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I like packed him up and ran out of that park and was like never going back.
Yeah.
Um, and I had no idea what happened and why. And I was like, what did I just see in my head? Like that was so disturbing and scary. And I didn't, I couldn't process it. So it became, its own trauma in my body, right? Like
Yes.
when you can't process something, you don't know what's happening, it just
Yeah.
gets stuck.
Yeah.
And then it just became a pattern after that. And so my world got so much smaller during that pregnancy
Mm-hmm.
because I started to isolate. I didn't want to be in public spaces. I thought if I avoided this place or avoided that place, then I wouldn't trigger these things that I was seeing. And so I was really reduced to such a small space at that point.
Okay. So how like frequently were you experiencing this intensity? Is it like
Daily.
multiple times a day?
Yeah. It
Oh,
was daily, multiple
yeah.
times a day. It was constant. It felt like, I couldn't really, there was no really escaping what was playing out in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so ashamed and so afraid to like relay what I was seeing to anybody that I think I only told one friend at the time what was happening. And she was so understanding and gentle with me and so loving. Like she just, I love her so much. She's in Australia now, so I don't really get to see her or talk to her, but she was very supportive in that, even she couldn't understand it, she couldn't label it, she couldn't tell me what was happening, but she was like, it's okay, like
Mm.
I'm here, even though you're expressing, these horrifying things to me, I still love you, and you're such a
Oh,
strong mom.
that's beautiful.
Um, it
That's
was,
what
it
people
was,
need. That's what
it
people need.
was. It was so fantastic to have her because I think I would
Mm.
have lost it completely if I
Right.
didn't have that.
Right. It's
Um,
right. I mean, like you were saying, it's so isolating. It can be so scary,
yeah.
and so disorienting. Like the
Yes.
kind of what is happening, why is it happening,
Yep.
can get really um, deep and entrenched and start to make you feel terrible about yourself.
It did. I thought I was a monster. I
Mm,
was like, there's no other explanation for what
mm,
I'm seeing is either I'm a horrible person or I'm, being tormented by some demonic spirit or something. And like
yeah.
my mind just was trying to make up any justification as to like what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I sought out, a shaman. I sought out like someone who could do a clearing for me. I was buying crystals. I was trying to sage my home. I was like trying to find any answer to why something was just now affecting me for the first time in my life. And it didn't make sense.
So
Um,
this was like in your internal experience was primarily the intrusive thoughts,
yes. Yeah.
and that was the scary part. And it almost, um, like you said, you said it felt like she brought something with her in a way. Your daughter in the
Hmm.
pregnancy. So during that time, how were you coping with it? I mean, I hear that like reaching out to the shaman and all of that stuff, which totally makes, a lot of sense. You're trying to just relieve yourself in whatever way you can figure
Yeah.
out how.
I was
What,
grasping at straws,
sure,
really.
sure. Yeah. What was
Yeah.
happening like in the moment or directly after, or, how were you coping with it?
So, like I said, my world got really small. I wasn't socializing as much. I wasn't able to take my son on these play dates. I wasn't able to go to the park very often. I wasn't able to, the grocery stores were really exasperating because I was having to use all of my strength to cope with the sensations that I was feeling in my body, the anxiety, the sort of trauma response that I would have to these intrusive thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And I would rush back home and just try to like hide out in this space. And I cried a lot on the phone to my brother. I cried a lot on the phone to my best friend. I, tried to escape with TV and just anything that people could cope with, right?
Sure.
At the time. Honestly, it's so much of a blur back then, I think, because of the way that my body responded to it. It protects me from a lot of like revisiting
Mm-hmm.
of that moment, because it was just so hard and so painful and so shockingly isolating that I can only access tidbits, you know, which is hard too. There's so much
Right.
grief because I didn't get to really fully be present for my daughter's infancy. I
Mm-hmm.
missed a lot of my son's, younger years because I was just trying to survive and I wasn't thriving. I wasn't able to do, and be a happy mom and be present for them.
Mm.
It was like all a blur of just trying to breastfeed her, trying to survive that. She had oral ties, and so breastfeeding her was really challenging in comparison to my son.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I suffered a lot, and I had a lot of paranoia about her growth and her weight gain, and I couldn't see, um, I couldn't see, that she was doing well. Like in my head, it was like a body dysmorphia type
Mm-hmm.
experience. I
Mm-hmm.
was so worried about her all the time and I
Did it
couldn't see
feel
that
like
she was
anxiety?
okay.
Like, did
It
it
was.
it
It was
feel
a
like?
lot of
Mm-hmm.
anxiety. It was a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that panic attack, heart racing, body tingling, upset stomach. Like I couldn't eat after I had her. I was so nauseous and
Mm.
I was so
From
stressed out
worry. Okay.
from worry and from anxiety and from just my nervous system being so dysregulated
Right.
that I struggled with eating. I lost so much weight so rapidly postpartum that I thought I was dying.
Mm-hmm.
I became so fixated on all of my symptoms that I was
Mm-hmm.
experiencing head to toe. So my OCD presented, how there's multiple categories, right,
Mm-hmm.
for intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
And mine presented probably almost all of them. I had, the health and contamination OCD. So I was very afraid to like bring my kids out to the park and
Right.
socialize.
Right.
I couldn't let anyone in because I was always worried that they were going to come in and get us sick and then I wouldn't be able to take care of anybody.
Right.
Um, I had harm OCD, so I was having intrusive thoughts about hurting my babies and my son, and I was trying to keep a distance to make sure that I wasn't going to do anything and not realize it. I think
Uh-huh.
that was my main concern was that I was afraid that I would
Yeah.
do something and not know that I did it until afterwards, and
Mm-hmm.
then I would be, devastated.
Mm-hmm.
So I
So
was terrified
can
to
I just
sleep.
ask? I think that's an important point about what it feels like. And it, like in your experience, was there ever a time where you weren't? How do I want to ask it? There's like a level of hypervigilance that comes with what you're describing.
Hmm.
That it's almost like you're paying attention to so much and so many details. Um, and so part of the worry is that you will miss some of that. You
Hmm.
won't see some of it, but also you're like paying attention more than you ever have about it. So it's the amount of attention you're actually paying to something versus the fear that you won't. It doesn't match up, but that's also part of the OCD feeling. Is it
Hmm.
feels like you can never do enough.
Yeah, it was utterly exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't sleep. So I was terrified my body couldn't settle. I couldn't relax. It was just in a constant state of that fight flight activation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was afraid that if I, fell asleep, that I would do something in my sleep. I'd kill my kids and I'd wake up and discover them dead or something. And I wouldn't be able to take that back.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really hard in those early, probably first 8 months, because I was just so paranoid about everything, so hypervigilant, so over aware of what was happening in my mind and my body that I couldn't sleep. There was no resting.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I say, I didn't get, I wasn't ever fully diagnosed at that point, right? This is all hindsight. And so part of me wonders if I was going through psychosis as well, because I was just
Mm-hmm.
so activated all the time. And while I didn't have hallucinations, I didn't have, those delusional beliefs of like, I need to, sacrifice my baby for him to be well or whatever. I did have a lot of the other symptoms of psychosis. And so I sometimes wonder if that may have been a component.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know.
Right. I mean, it sounds like it was so intense. Plus that the paranoia that you're describing. I mean, sure, there's like levels of anxiety, paranoia being one of the most intense.
Mhm.
But when it starts to tip over into those areas, it can become more sort of gray. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
It can be hard to know. I mean, if you're with a really skilled clinician or somebody who can help you figure that out, it's easier. But I mean, it's so right. You're still kind of left with questions about it.
Yeah, I am, even though my daughter's almost 8, I still have to like try to piece together what was this?
Mm-hmm.
How did I make it through this? And I think it was sheer, willpower at that point to just power through and survive and make sure everyone was alive. But
But this is an incredible amount of time that you're talking
yeah,
about, where
it
you're
was
suffering at that high intensity. I mean, how long would you say?
at least her first year.
Uh-huh.
Initially, her first year was the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
I
Plus
think I
during
was about,
pregnancy.
yeah, from second trimester on. So it was a really, really long time. And I wasn't fully disclosing. I did go in and out to my midwife a lot. I was asking her to run blood work and find a root cause because, like I said, I lost so much weight rapidly. I couldn't eat.
Mm-hmm.
I had so many different physical manifestation of symptoms in my body from the anxiety and from the OCD, like intrusive thoughts about my health, about my kids' health, about harming them. There was, and I think the most terrifying and very under acknowledged one for me, this is the one that really terrified my soul, was the sexual intrusive thoughts, the nature of that. I had
Yeah.
never experienced that before,
They're
especially in relation
horrible.
to my children.
Yes.
And so that's what made me feel so much of a monster because I thought,
Mm-hmm.
who the hell sees this stuff when they
Right.
have kids?
Right.
And where is this coming from? No one had talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no literature for me to find on Google about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was so, so afraid to disclose any of that to anyone. Um, but I try to
When
have
did
the
you
courage
start
now.
of that? Yeah, I'm really grateful that you talk about it. I agree it's not discussed as much. It's a symptom that I experienced also, and it was horrifying. It was so
Yeah.
terrible. Um, but it's one of those things where people don't want to say anything because it can be easily misconstrued. Like you were saying before, if you say it to the wrong person at the wrong time or whatever, um,
Hmm.
somebody might misinterpret what your experience is and start making assumptions about stuff. So it is hard to. I'm grateful that you're speaking out about it because it sucks. It's just horrible.
It is. It's really horrible. And when I did try to tell someone close to me that was in my immediate postpartum what I was seeing, the nature of those thoughts, I never saw them again. They just completely cut contact. And then I felt again like, oh shit, I shouldn't have said
Mm-hmm.
anything.
Right.
What does that mean? What does this person think of me now?
Right.
And it was its own trauma and pain, to have to go through
Yes.
that. Um,
So can
so
I
it
ask you?
was
I
about
know
18 months before I found answers with my daughter.
it took you how long?
About 18 months
Mm-hmm.
postpartum.
Mm-hmm. How did
Yeah.
you find those answers?
Um, honestly, that is hard to make sense of too. because I
Mm-hmm.
was on Facebook and I made a very desperate like post about how I just couldn't take it anymore. And I was just at my wit's end.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how I was connected to this person on Facebook, but they saw my post and they commented on it and offered to speak to me. And so I messaged that person and that's at that point, I think I lost my grip on being able to keep it all inside. And I just was like, blah, here
Right,
you go.
right.
This is what's
There's only
happening.
there's only so much you can hold in, and
Yeah.
we're not we're not meant we're not built to hold all of that in and for it to have no effect on us.
Yeah. And so that person then was able to normalize for me, like, oh, this is what's happening to you. It's not that you're a monster. It's not that this, and that's when I was like, oh,
This is a thing.
okay, this is the thing now. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just me, and I'm not absolutely insane,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not, I don't need an exorcism and yada, yada, yada. You know what I mean? Like it
I
was,
do.
yeah, it was relieving to finally have a space for someone to say, "Oh, I know what's happening to you, and
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, and like you're gonna get through it."
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that began. Was I initiated a relationship with this person? She was a mental health sort of outside of the system. She's got all of the degrees and the training and the mental health background, but she doesn't have that license restricting her to only working in that one state. So she began a relationship with me and we started talking, and it became therapeutic, and I spent about 5 years working with her, um, unpeeling the layers of all that was involved, and all of my childhood and all of my experiences with relationships, and all of the things that go into life, right? Just peeling all of that back, trying to make sense of what led to that, what how this got here, how to cope with that experience and that trauma and these thoughts. um so yeah, it took a really long time, but it was like serendipitous. She
Right.
was there at
Mm-hmm.
the time that I was ready to lose it.
Mm-hmm.
And then that relationship was what helped me to move forward.
So I want to go back just what is great. I'm so glad you found or somehow that happened and you got
Hmm.
your way to some healing. Um, that's incredibly important. I know you said that for the second pregnancy you didn't want to use any medications or have any medication intervention. Was there any point during that process where you thought about that maybe medication could help, or was it just like absolutely a no?
It
That's
was
not an
absolutely
option.
a no. It was just not an option for me. I think I did take Ativan probably once or twice postpartum when I had her, and I think immediately something happened with like my liver enzymes. And so I was like, okay, I can't take any medications. Like my body's just out of whack. It's not handling things well. And I realized, I just didn't want anything in the mix to give me more side effects than I was already experiencing. I didn't know what was going on and what was connected to what and why I was experiencing all of these symptoms. And I didn't want to risk having more things added to complicate what I was already going through.
And it's so tough because you didn't at that time anyways while you were going through that part of a pregnancy and early postpartum didn't have um, a connection to somebody who could help you figure that out. Like you not only were trying to survive all of what you were experiencing, but also trying to figure it out when you are
Mhm.
not, um, I guess, like your functioning and your capacity for just getting through the day was so focused on just kind of it sounds like survival
Yeah.
um, that it's honestly it's really hard to figure stuff out when you're in that state of mind because it's so intensely emotional and feels so overwhelming cognitively that like putting energy into figuring something out it might you might like have a couple of seconds where you can focus enough but otherwise um, you're like you're drinking from a fire hose. It's
Yes.
too much.
Yes, absolutely. That's kind of actually how it felt. It's a good
Okay.
representation of how
Okay.
much it felt like I was drowning and suffocating and
Yeah.
so overwhelmed and just could not function.
Hmm.
But I had to, I
Right.
had to show up every
Yeah.
single day
Yeah.
to make sure my son was okay and my daughter was okay. And, you know, I'm still alive at the end of this
Right.
so that we can do this again tomorrow. And
Right.
still, I'm still waking up in this fresh hell every single day,
Mm.
just repeating it.
Well,
Um,
I do
yeah.
have a question about that because sometimes there is a what somebody feels like internally is different
Hmm.
from what they look like externally. So
Hmm.
if somebody were to like walk, see you outside, would they have noticed how much distress you were in, or do you? And that's a little hard to say. Or but do you feel
Yeah.
like it was so internal and you were doing all of the things so it looked like you were fine?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know because so many people, well, it's complex because I was not letting anyone in. First of
Mm.
all, I was keeping a pretty tight, like, boundary.
Ah.
And the people that did see me, they would see me briefly and probably not realize how much internal like alarms were going off because I
Right.
was trying to make sure that no one suspected that I was a threat, that I was, I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy so
Mm.
that they would then, try to take my kids. So I was trying to hold everything, kind of like that fire hose, right? I was trying to like keep that from going off in public so that no one would suspect.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine, my midwife probably had suspicions,
Mm-hmm.
but there was limited, things that she could do in that regard. And maybe a neighbor might have, because I would try to bring my kid over every once in a while, but couldn't last long in that environment due to my OCD and my contamination concerns and stuff. So they probably just thought I was like weird,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, she's really weird. That's,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they picked up that fact that I was just suffering immensely internally.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Um, and there's only a couple of people that know what's going on, and
Hmm.
and not to the full extent
Yeah.
of what's really happening. Right. So, thanks for
I
going
think I
into
might
that a
have
little
done a
more.
really well, a good job at hiding it,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is tough, because I desperately needed the help and
Yes.
I wish somebody would have been able to reach out and
Yeah.
like give me that hand and pull me
Yes.
out.
Yes.
But I wasn't allowing it to, I
Right.
wasn't going to show it to anybody.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, there's just so many from where I'm sitting. I guess there's so many layers of complexity for sure, but in particular for like pretending everything's okay and then also masking symptoms.
Hmm.
If you as somebody who's neurodivergent and trying to get through the world, you already have a skill set
At
of
masking.
at
Yeah.
masking and like pretending everything's okay. And then also as women, we do that.
Hmm.
We've learned that along the way, and also as mothers.
Yep.
It's just like so many layers of pretending like everything's okay, and compensating or overcompensating for the things where we feel like are our weaknesses or where people might judge us or all of that stuff. So like even if you had none of the other stuff you were dealing with, just like the masking of everything is its own stress.
Hmm.
It's so much work
It
and
is.
takes so much energy. So like by the time you reached that lady or she reached you or whatever happened there,
Hmm.
you were ready to. I mean, you
Yeah.
couldn't contain it,
Yeah.
really, any
Because I had
longer.
tried. I had tried to find a therapist. I had reached
Uh,
out to PSI and I
mm-hmm,
had tried to find a therapist and I
mm-hmm,
had shown up to that person's office and it
mm-hmm.
was beginning the intake paperwork, I think, but she triggered me. And I got the hell out of that office as fast as I could because I
Oh,
was like, she's not safe. I cannot disclose to her, even though I was told that she was, the person to deal with perinatal mental health stuff. How she treated me and how my body received her was like, nope, gotta go, can't do it. So I shut it down and ran out.
that sucks.
Um, so there was like, I had a lot of barriers to care,
Mm-hmm.
even though I
Mm-hmm.
tried.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, I went to a couple of doctors, like I told you, postpartum. I went to my midwife. I went to a different primary care physician, and they actually dismissed me from their office. They sent me a letter in the mail and said, go find someone else.
What?
Yeah,
That is wild. I
it was
can't
wild. I
imagine.
was like, why would a doctor abandon me during this situation? Because I
Because
was
they don't know
asking
what
them for
they didn't know
doing
what to
tests.
do.
Yeah, they just were like trying to offer me meds. I didn't want the meds. I said, I want you to find root cause, do the blood work, do the testing, figure it out. And then I got that letter in the mail, and I was like so devastated to be rejected by my own physician.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I often, well, I know that they, unfortunately, not everybody is trained on how to notice some of the mental health signs or symptoms. And maybe they did, who knows what their scope was or their capacity or whatnot, but still, like the net impact on you is like in some really horrible way, like rejection, but also potentially confirmation of like your own like worries about
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah, it was really hard to cope with,
Yeah.
and it took a while. It was until I decided to go into massive debt and find a naturopath and charge that to my credit card to get answers, because I didn't have, I didn't have it. I didn't have the money. I couldn't access these things, but I was bound and determined to get help. So
Mm-hmm.
I went into thousands of dollars of debt to work with a naturopath to get finally some confirmation of like, there is a physiological component here, and there is, there are reasons for why this could be happening, and let's start working on that. And then therapy was another, hurdle, but eventually I found someone to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of things that required me to pick myself back up after getting knocked on my butt.
Right. Right. Man, and you did. It always amazes me. I'm always sort of inspired, I guess, by how hard people try to get better even when it feels impossible.
Mm-hmm.
There's like still that something in you that keeps going and pushing and trying to figure it out. Um, and it's just, I don't know how all that shakes out, like how it actually happens. But you know, if you're suffering, there's sometimes parts of you that want to just give up, and then there's this other part of you that wants to keep fighting. And so that part, at least from where I'm sitting, like that part won out, and you found it.
It is, yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because it does trigger a memory of like that wrestling between
Mm-hmm.
that suicidality and wanting to end it all and just stop suffering because you're in so much massive pain. And then that, like, I don't want anyone else to raise my children. I have to be here. I have to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be wrestling that
Yeah.
every day. Mama,
Right.
help, because it was just the thought of like leaving them behind and not getting to know them and having who knows what happened to them was like, nope, I can't do
Yep.
it.
That's what.
And
Yep.
that would be what kept me, to get back up, to keep
Mm-hmm.
fighting.
Right. Right. So your process, your healing process, took a number of years.
It did.
Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, you got the support you needed, you got the help you needed, um, and now you're supporting other people.
Yeah, I am. I went to, take PSI's training. I got my PMHC. I volunteer with them now to help start mentoring other, people who are going through this as well.
Mm,
And I try to educate care providers in my community, try to build that network. Where
nice.
I was at when I gave birth to my daughter, like I told you, had no options. There was no one there trained in perinatal mental health. So I made it a goal of mine last year to reach out to other care providers and funnel them into training and get them onto the path to certification
Mm-hmm.
so that there
Nice.
are options in that city
Right.
now where, there was nothing there for me when I
Oh,
was
that's
there.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
you're having a big impact. I'm sure. That's to go from really nobody trained to having people around who know what to look for and maybe questions to ask. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, it was really, really important to me that nobody else have to suffer the way that I did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I almost didn't make it through it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah.
it was a miracle that I made it here at this point. So many other moms don't, unfortunately,
Yeah.
that is a real risk
It
with
is.
this. And I don't want that to happen. As long as I'm here on this earth, I want to be able to make an impact so that other moms can get the safe help that they need and not have to worry about disclosing to the wrong person, losing their children, or potentially being separated from their children because, that was a whole added layer. I didn't want to go to the ER. I didn't want to go and get help because I was breastfeeding my daughter and I didn't want to have to break that bond.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to have to choose, like, am I going to be there to feed my kid or can I go get the help that I need?
Right.
Um, so that really inspired me once I got my foot on the ground to be able to try and create these things that I needed that didn't exist.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I'm so glad you made it through and that you are have found enough healing to be able to help others.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's been an immensely, you know, magnificent journey full of pain and grief and loss and transformation and
Yeah.
constant rebuilding of myself and trying to make sense of that and
Mm-hmm.
figuring out how to turn that into something I can give to the world. Because why else would I have gone through that?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
I need to make it make sense. I need
Right.
to make it have a purpose.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Yep.
otherwise, it's just torture for
Mm-hmm.
no reason. So I'm like, I'm gonna just do that best I can with what I went through for other people.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Tiffany, so much for coming on and sharing your story. There are so many parts of this that I know at least one person can resonate with, if not multiple parts of it. And also, for people who are in the depths of struggling and it can hear this and know that even when you feel as bad as you felt, that there is a way to get better and feel better is so important. And you've given people a lot of hope today. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kat, for giving me this space to share my story and holding it so tenderly. I really appreciate that. And I really do want to leave your audience with that hope, even if it feels utterly hopeless,
Mm,
take that step for yourself because you deserve it. And I will hope that, you find what you need to get better.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Tiffany. And if you guys would like to get connected with her, you can go to tiffanyengindula.com or on Instagram, Tiffany E Full Spectrum Doula. For anyone out there who feels like they might be experiencing something like this, you can always reach out to postpartum.net, Postpartum Support International, and look at the wide variety of support options that are free for you. There are online support groups, there's a provider directory, is a peer support program, and PSI can help get you connected to the help you deserve and need. Please be sure you're subscribed to the Mom and Mind podcast so that you receive all of these episodes downloaded to you directly to your phone. It is free. The only thing you need to do is subscribe so that you can access all of the episodes and pick and choose the ones that you want to listen to. There are over 330 episodes and counting to pick from, and one or many of them could meet your needs. You can go to any podcast platform or you can go to wellmindperinatal.com to see all of those episodes laid out. There's a search function on the website so you can look into what topics you'd prefer to listen to. And you can also check out the courses page and see what I'm offering there for people who need a little bit extra support, especially when you're waiting for a therapist. There are some courses on there to help you understand and cope with what you're going through. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time.